Imagine walking into a crowded market in Victorian England and seeing a husband dragging his wife with a rope around her neck ready to sell her off to the highest bidder. Just like livestock. This wasn't a rumor. It was a horrifying reality. But here's the darkest part. Women themselves sometimes agreed to it, and society looked the other way. Why would a culture built on morality allow something so brutal? What secret reasons forced men to sell their wives like property? The truth is far more disturbing than you can ever imagine. Watch till the end to uncover the shocking reality, and make sure to subscribe to my channel so you never miss these hidden stories from history. In the bustling streets of Victorian England, where horse-drawn carriages rolled through cobbled lanes and chimneys, spat black smoke into a gray sky, there was a disturbing practice that few today can even imagine. In a society that prided itself on morality, manners, and progress, many men were openly selling their wives as if they were property, livestock, or old furniture. It was not hidden, not whispered, but done in public markets, on street corners, and sometimes even in local taverns where crowds would gather to watch a wife led in with a rope tied around her neck, her wrist, or even her waist. This was not a rare oddity, it was a spectacle, a tradition, and a tragic reality for many women trapped in unhappy marriages during the 18th and 19th centuries. Carrying on well into the Victorian era, to understand why such a cruel and humiliating act became normalized, we need to step into the lives of ordinary people in Victorian Britain. Marriage in those days was not about love or companionship for most working-class families. It was about survival, reputation, and necessity. The legal system made divorce almost impossible for poor families. If a couple was miserable, trapped in endless quarrels, poverty, and resentment, the husband had very few legal options. Divorce was only accessible to the wealthy, as it required an act of parliament, enormous fees, and public scandal. A poor laborer earning just a few shillings a week could never dream of it. But that did not mean he was stuck forever. Instead, he turned to a cruel loophole: he could sell his wife. The sale of wives was never officially legal, but it was tolerated by communities and sometimes even supported by local authorities, as if it was a poor man's divorce. Newspapers of the time reported on wife sales as if they were simply part of daily life, giving detailed descriptions of the women, the crowds, and the bidding process. The idea was simple. If a man no longer wanted his wife, he would lead her into the marketplace, sometimes dressed in her best clothes, sometimes ragged, but often with a halter or rope to symbolize ownership. Crowds would gather, and the auctioneer or the husband himself would announce that the wife was for sale. It sounds barbaric, and it was. But for some women, this practice was both a curse and a strange kind of opportunity. Many of these wives were not unwilling victims dragged into the marketplace against their will. Quite the opposite. Sometimes they went willingly, even eagerly, hoping to be purchased by another man they actually preferred. It was humiliating, yes, but it was also one of the only ways a woman could escape a bad marriage and find herself in the arms of someone she chose, even if it meant being passed like property in front of jeering neighbors. In a society where women had almost no rights, wife selling was twisted into a crude form of empowerment for some. But of course, not all stories had happy endings. For many women, being sold was terrifying. Imagine being tied with a rope and marched into a public square where hundreds of eyes stared at you, laughing, mocking, or even pitying. You had no control over who might bid for you. A cruel man, a drunkard, a violent stranger, anyone with enough coins could buy you. Your past life was erased, your children often taken from you, your identity reduced to an object of trade. Once, the deal was struck. A handshake sealed your fate, and you were expected to follow your new husband without complaint. The custom of wife selling has been recorded in shocking detail. In one case, in 1832, a man led his wife into the marketplace of Carlisle with a halter around her neck. The crowd jeered and laughed as if it were a festive occasion. She was sold for a few shillings to a man she had been secretly in love with. The sale was even celebrated by the community, as if it were a kind of wedding. In another case, however, a woman was sold to a stranger against her will, and the crowd witnessed her crying and screaming as she was dragged away. These stories reveal the dual nature of the practice, sometimes an escape, sometimes a tragedy. Why was this tolerated for so long? Part of the answer lies in the deep inequality of Victorian society. Men controlled almost every aspect of life. A wife was legally considered the property of her husband. She could not own property independently. Her wages belonged to him, and her body was essentially his to control. The law and the church insisted that once married, a woman's identity was merged into her husband's. She had little say in her own fate. If a man could own his wife, then in the minds of many working-class men, he could also sell her. But another reason why wife-selling persisted was practicality. Communities saw it as a useful way to end a failed marriage without resorting to endless conflict. People would gossip, yes, but they would also accept the new arrangement. Once a woman was sold, the old husband was usually expected to stay out of her life. The new husband would take responsibility for her, and in many cases, the woman herself would be happier in her new arrangement. It was crude, humiliating, and degrading, but it was also a system born out of desperation in a world with no alternatives. Yet this does not erase the cruelty of the spectacle. Public wife sales often attracted huge crowds, turning human misery into entertainment. It was like a carnival, where neighbors gathered to watch and mock, where beer flowed, and where the cries of a humiliated woman became the punchline of crude jokes. Children watched as their mothers were sold, learning from an early age that women were objects, not people. Newspapers reported on these events with disturbing casualness, sometimes even humor, reinforcing the idea that this was normal. The horrific part is not just the act itself, but what it reveals about Victorian society. This was an era that preached morality, family values, and the sanctity of marriage. Respectable Victorians condemned prostitution, drunkenness, and vice. But many turned a blind eye to wife selling, as long as it was done quietly and without scandal among the poor. The hypocrisy is staggering. The same society that claimed to honor women as the angels of the home allowed them to be paraded like cattle in markets. The wives themselves, however, were not always silent victims. Some resisted fiercely, refusing to go with the men who purchased them. In rare cases, crowds intervened, and women were rescued from being forced into sales. In other cases, wives cleverly manipulated the system. They convinced their husbands to sell them to the men they truly loved, using the ritual of the market as a twisted kind of wedding ceremony. There are accounts of wives laughing during their own sale, pleased that they had tricked the system and secured freedom from an abusive or lazy husband. Still, the practice left deep scars. Many women were separated from their children forever. The law gave custody to fathers, and when a wife was sold, she usually had to leave her children behind. For a mother, this was often the greatest pain, not the humiliation of the marketplace, but the heartbreak of losing her family. The story of wife selling is not just about bizarre customs. It is about poverty, inequality, and the desperate search for freedom in a world that gave women none. It is about how ordinary people bent the rules of society to survive. It is about cruelty masked as tradition, and about laughter hiding the screams of the forgotten. In the next part of this story, we will go even deeper into the lives of these women and men, exploring real cases, shocking details, and the voices of those who lived through this haunting chapter of history, because behind every wife sold was not just a transaction, but a tragedy waiting to be uncovered. When we left off, the image of a woman tied with a halter, marched into a marketplace, and auctioned off like cattle was fresh in our minds. It is hard to imagine such a sight in a society that prided itself on civility, industry, and progress. Yet, in Victorian Britain, wife selling was not just an occasional scandal. It was woven into the fabric of daily life for many working-class families. And to truly understand how widespread, normalized, and shocking this practice was, we need to look at the stories, the real human stories that reveal the pain, the desperation, and sometimes the strange relief that came with such public humiliations. One of the earliest detailed accounts of a wife's sale comes from 1733, long before Queen Victoria took the throne. A man from Birmingham led his wife into the public marketplace, a rope tied around her waist, and auctioned her off to the highest bidder. The crowd watched with laughter and curiosity as if they were at a fair. A butcher stepped forward, placed a bid, and won. The wife was led away. The husband pocketed the money, and the crowd dispersed, satisfied that they had witnessed something unusual yet strangely acceptable. That early account set a precedent. Over the decades, more and more such sales appeared in newspapers, always treated as curiosities but never condemned with full seriousness. By the time of the Victorian era, the practice was practically a ritual in some towns. One particularly infamous case occurred in 1832 in Carlisle, in the north of England. A man named Joseph Thompson led his wife, Mary, into the marketplace with a rope tied around her neck. The crowd laughed, jeered, and called out bids. Mary stood silently, waiting, while her husband loudly declared he was selling her because he could no longer live with her. After a few moments of mock bidding, another man, Henry Mears, stepped forward and offered 1 shilling and a pint of beer. The deal was struck, the crowd roared with approval, and Mary was led away by Henry. But here's the twist, Mary was happy about it. She had been in love with Henry for some time, and Joseph knew it. The sale was their way of making the arrangement official in the eyes of their neighbors. For Mary, this humiliating ritual was a door to freedom, but not all women were so fortunate. Imagine a wife who was not in love with another man, not looking for escape, but dragged into the marketplace against her will. One chilling account tells of a woman in Dorset in 1835, who screamed and cried as her husband led her by a halter to the auction block. The crowd mocked her tears, and the bidding was fierce. She was sold to a stranger she had never seen before, and her children were left behind with her former husband. She begged to stay with her children, but the crowd laughed and dismissed. Her cries, her story, like so many others, was never told again. She disappeared into obscurity. her fate sealed by a few coins and a public handshake. The more we look into these stories, the more we realize how wife-selling reveals the deep inequalities of Victorian society. For men, it was often a way to get rid of a wife they no longer wanted, sometimes in exchange for beer, money, or even livestock. For women, it could mean freedom if they were lucky, but more often it meant humiliation, pain, and separation from their children. And what makes it even worse is how entire communities treated these sales as entertainment. They were not whispered about in shame. They were announced, publicized, and sometimes even advertised in advance. One newspaper article from 1837 in Leeds described a wife sale in chillingly casual terms. It read, "On Monday last, at the marketplace, a fellow disposed of his wife by auction. She was purchased by another man for 5 shillings. The parties appeared satisfied, and the bargain was concluded with great cheerfulness." That was the language of the press, cheerful, casual, amused. The suffering of the wife was never mentioned. Her name was often left out, as if she were an object, not a person. And yet, despite all this cruelty, there was a strange logic to the practice. Divorce, as mentioned earlier, was almost impossible for ordinary people. The Matrimonial Causes Act, which allowed civil divorce, was not passed until 1857. Before that, divorce required an act of parliament and enormous fees. Even after 1857, the system heavily favored men. A husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone, but a wife had to prove adultery plus cruelty or desertion. For poor families, even this legal route was still far too expensive. So what was left? Wife-selling. It became the poor man's divorce court, carried out in public, settled with coins instead of lawyers, and sealed with a crowd's approval, instead of a judge's decree. But let's not mistake practicality for fairness. Women had no real choice. If a husband wanted to sell his wife, there was little she could do to stop him. In many cases, she might accept it, especially if she had another man waiting. But if she resisted, her cries were drowned out by This is where the cruelty lies, not in the rare cases where love found a way, but in the countless cases where women were treated as less than human. Historians have uncovered dozens of such cases, and the details are often shocking. In 1820, a woman in Nottingham was sold for just 2 pence. 2 pence the price of a loaf of bread. In 1830, in Manchester, a man sold his wife for a few shillings and a glass of gin. The newspaper noted the event with dry humor, making light of the fact that a woman's entire life had been exchanged for a drink. In some cases, wives were even swapped, as if they were items of trade. 2 men unhappy with their marriages would meet, agree to swap wives, and then stage a mock auction in the marketplace to make the exchange appear official. Even more disturbing were the sales that involved children. Sometimes a wife would be sold with her child beside her, the two treated as a package deal. More often, however, the children were left with the father, since the law gave custody to him. This was the deepest wound for many mothers. To be sold was one thing, to be torn from your children forever was another. Imagine the pain of a woman watching her children cry as she was led away by a stranger, never to see them again. This happened again and again, and yet the community treated it as entertainment. That, as shocking as this was, what might be even more shocking is how long the practice lasted. Many people think of wife-selling as a medieval custom, something from the Dark Ages, but the truth is, cases were still reported well into the late 19th century. Even as Queen Victoria ruled over a vast empire, even as railways and factories transformed the world, even as morality and propriety were preached from every pulpit, wife sales continued in the shadows of markets and taverns. The government never passed a law directly banning wife selling. It was always technically illegal, but because it was tolerated by communities and sometimes even local magistrates, it persisted. It wasn't until public opinion slowly began to shift in the late Victorian era that the practice began to fade. More and more newspapers began to criticize it as barbaric and shameful. Reformers argued that it degraded women and mocked the institution of marriage. And as divorce laws gradually became more accessible, the need for such desperate measures declined. But until then, the markets echoed with the laughter of crowds, the cries of women, and the clinking of coins sealing the cruelest of bargains. If we step back and look at the bigger picture, wife selling is not just about a bizarre custom. It is a mirror reflecting the reality of women's lives in Victorian Britain. Women had no legal identity separate from their husbands. They could not vote, could not own property independently, could not keep their wages. In such a world, being sold like cattle was not a shocking contradiction. It was simply the logical extreme of a society that treated women as property. The fact that it was done in public only made it more visible. And yet, there is something haunting in the way some women tried to turn this cruel ritual into an opportunity. There are stories of wives smiling during their sale, pleased that they were escaping a drunkard, a brute, or a lazy man who refused to work. For them, the humiliation of the marketplace was worth it if it meant freedom or love. These women remind us of the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to find light, even in the darkest of traditions. But for every woman who escaped, there were countless others who suffered in silence, whose names we will never know, whose stories were never recorded. As we move deeper into this disturbing chapter of history, we must ask ourselves, what does this say about the society that allowed it? How could a people so proud of their progress, their morals, and their values accept such cruelty in their midst? The answer lies not just in poverty, not just in desperation, but in the very fabric of Victorian society, a world where appearances mattered more than reality, where respectability masked hypocrisy, and where women were seen not as individuals, but as extensions of men. In the next part of this story, we will uncover even more haunting cases, explore how the press fueled the spectacle, and see how wife-selling slowly began to die out. But before we move forward, one thing is clear. The horrific reason why Victorian men sold their wives was not just about money, or escape, or tradition. It was about power. And in Victorian Britain, that power always belonged to men. By now, we have seen how wife-selling was not some rare oddity, but a practice woven into the fabric of Victorian society. We have heard the stories of women humiliated, children torn away, and husbands trading their wives for a few coins, or a drink. But what makes this chapter of history even more haunting is the way the spectacle of wife-selling spread beyond the marketplace. It was not just a desperate man's solution to a failed marriage. It became a form of public theater, a community ritual, and in many ways, a symbol of everything that was broken in Victorian marriage laws. To understand how this strange ritual was sustained for so long, we must step into the world of the Victorian press. Newspapers were the lifeblood of Victorian society. They reported everything, from high politics to petty crimes, from royal scandals to drunken brawls, and wife-selling fit perfectly into their appetite for stories that mixed shock, amusement, and moral curiosity. When a wife was sold in a market, there was a good chance that someone would write about it. Sometimes the accounts were short and almost mocking, like a fellow disposed of his wife yesterday in the town market. She was purchased for a few shillings, and all parties seemed satisfied. But other times, reporters leaned into the drama, painting the scene in lurid detail, describing the rope tied around a woman's neck, the drunken laughter of the crowd, and the final handshake sealing the deal. But here's the dark irony. Newspapers rarely condemned the practice outright. They treated it as amusing, eccentric, even quaint, a curiosity of English life. As one paper put it, the suffering of the women was ignored, their names often left out, while the men were quoted at length as if they were the real victims of a bad marriage. This casual, mocking tone helped normalize the practice, turning human tragedy into entertainment for readers across Britain. And the spectacle was not just in print. Imagine the scene in the marketplace itself. Crowds gathered, not just to watch, but to participate. Some would call out bids, others would cheer or laugh. In many towns, it became a kind of folk ritual carried out with a sense of tradition. Men would lead their wives with halters, sometimes even decorated like livestock, and the crowd treated the entire affair as a carnival. It was not a private shemet, it was a public event. One account from 1842 describes a man in Oxfordshire who brought his wife to the market square, tied with a rope around her waist. He stood on a wooden stool, calling out like an auctioneer, while the crowd pressed in to watch. When another man agreed to buy her for a few shillings, the husband insisted that the deal include custody of the children. The crowd cheered when the buyer accepted, and the man proudly declared himself free of his troublesome wife. The woman's face was never described. Her voice was never heard. She was an object, passed from one man to another in front of laughing neighbors. But beneath the jeers and laughter, there was also tension. Not everyone approved of wife-selling. Some magistrates and church leaders condemned it, calling it immoral and degrading. Yet others quietly tolerated it, seeing it as a practical solution for poor families who could never afford divorce. In this way, Victorian society revealed its contradictions, a society obsessed with morality and appearances, yet willing to look the other way when women were treated as cattle. The contradictions went deeper still. On one hand, Victorian men preached about honor, duty, and the sanctity of marriage. On the other hand, they could march their wives into a market and sell them like livestock without facing serious punishment. Women were told that their role was to uphold the purity and dignity of the household, but in reality, their dignity could be stripped away in a matter of minutes. And for the women themselves, the experience was as varied as it was painful. Some, as we've seen, welcomed the chance to leave a cruel or neglectful husband, especially if another man they loved was willing to buy them. For those women, the sale was a humiliating but effective escape. But for many others, it was nothing short of betrayal. They were not given a choice. They were dragged, tied, jeered at, and forced into a new life they did not want. Consider the case of a woman in 1862, sold in the town of Leeds. Her husband, a factory worker, brought her into the market, declaring he was tired of her nagging and wanted her gone. She wept openly, begging him not to go through with it. The crowd mocked her tears, shouting that she should be happy to be rid of him. In the end, she was sold for 5 shillings to another man she had never met. Her husband left with the money, the crowd dispersed, and she was taken away. The newspapers recorded the event as a lively scene, with no mention of her misery. That was the reality. Women's voices silenced, their pain erased, while men's actions were celebrated as comic relief. That there is another angle to this story that is often overlooked: the children. In Victorian society, children belonged to the father by law. If a wife was sold, she almost always lost her children. Even if she was the more loving, caring parent, the law did not recognize her rights. Many mothers pleaded with their husbands not to separate them from their children. But when the auctioneer's gavolor, in this case, the husband's word came down, there was nothing they could do. For many women, this was the greatest cruelty of all. To be sold was humiliating, but to be torn away from one's children was unbearable, and yet, it happened again and again, with the crowd treating it as little more than sport. The wife-selling ritual also highlights the deep divide between classes. For wealthy families, there were always ways to hide scandals. A rich man could quietly separate from his wife, or pay for a legal arrangement, or simply keep a mistress while maintaining appearances. But for the poor, every problem played out in public. They did not have lawyers, they did not have money, and they did not have privacy. The market square was their courtroom, their stage, and their prison all at once. Wife-selling was not only a reflection of patriarchy, it was a reflection of poverty, of desperation, of a society that offered no mercy to those at the bottom. And yet, despite the humiliation, some women managed to turn this cruel tradition to their advantage. There are accounts of wives who arranged the sales themselves, persuading their husbands to let them go, even paying the buyer with their own small savings. In these rare cases, the sale was less about humiliation and more about survival. But these stories only prove how desperate women were, forced to use the very tools of their own degradation to carve out a sliver of freedom. By the mid-19th century, reformers began to push back harder. Newspapers started to change their tone. Instead of treating wife-selling as a joke, some began to call it a disgrace. Campaigners argued that it shamed Britain in the eyes of the world, undermining the very values Victorians claimed to hold dear. And slowly, public opinion began to turn. But the fact that the practice persisted for so long, even into the late Victorian era, is a reminder of how deeply it was entrenched in the culture of the time. What does all this tell us? It tells us that wife-selling was not just about failed marriages, it was about control, it was about poverty. It was about a society that valued women so little that their lives could be auctioned off for a few coins and a glass of beer. It was about the hypocrisy of a world that preached morality while practicing cruelty. And it was about the silence of women, whose stories were erased from history, leaving us only fragments, glimpses, and scattered reports in newspapers that cared more about amusement than truth. As we prepare to enter the final part of this story, the question remains, what finally brought this cruel practice to an end? How did a society that allowed wife-selling for over a century finally turn against it? And what can these stories teach us today about power, gender, and the dangers of treating human beings as property? The answer lies in the slow rise of reform, the shifting power of women, and the relentless march of social change. But before we get there, we must take one last look into the lives of those who endured this cruel custom. Their voices may have been silenced in their time, but their pain echoes still. By now, we've walked through the darkest corners of Victorian society, where women were reduced to property, children torn away from their mothers, and husbands publicly laughing as they passed their wives to the highest bidder. We've seen how newspapers turned human misery into entertainment, how the law looked the other way, and how communities gathered in crowds as if it were a holiday spectacle. But the story does not end there. What makes this history even more important is understanding how it finally stopped, why the custom of wife-selling began to disappear, and what lessons it leaves for us today. The truth is, wife-selling did not vanish overnight. It wasn't that one law suddenly banned it, or one politician stood up and ended it forever. Instead, it was a slow, uneven process, shaped by many forces: social reform, the growing power of women's voices, and the shame of a nation trying to appear civilized while such brutal practices still lingered. In its streets, one of the biggest changes came with the rise of industrialization and urbanization. As the 19th century wore on, more and more people moved from rural villages into bustling cities. Life was no longer confined to small communities where everyone knew each other's business. The anonymity of city life meant that public rituals like wife-selling became harder to sustain. A man might get away with parading his wife through a small market town, but in the growing industrial cities, such acts drew harsher condemnation. The crowd was no longer just neighbors, they were strangers, reporters, officials, reformers. And in this new atmosphere, the spectacle looked less like tradition and more like barbarity. The law also began to shift, though slowly. The first cracks appeared in 1857 with the Matrimonial Causes Act. which for the first time made divorce somewhat more accessible outside of Parliament. The law was still heavily biased in favor of men-women, had to prove not only adultery but also additional offenses like cruelty or desertion, but it was a start. For many poor families, divorce was still impossible. But the very existence of a legal route began to weaken the social justification for selling wives. If separation could be handled in a courtroom, then dragging your wife into the marketplace seemed increasingly indefensible. At the same time, reformers and writers began to raise their voices. Campaigners for women's rights saw wives as a glaring example of how powerless women were under the law. Pamphlets, sermons, and essays began to circulate, condemning the practice as a stain on Britain's honor. The tone of newspapers shifted to where once they mocked or sensationalized wife-selling. By the late Victorian period, they increasingly described it with outrage and shame. The same public that once laughed began to frown. A practice that had once seemed amusing was now seen as a scandal, and perhaps most importantly, women themselves began to push back. The late 19th century was an age of rising female voices. The suffrage movement was gathering strength. Women were fighting for the right to own property, to keep their wages, to claim custody of their children, and eventually to vote. In this growing movement, the story of wife-selling was held up as evidence of the injustice women faced. It was used as a rallying cry, proof that until women had legal and social power, they would always be treated as less than human. Still, even as reform spread, wife-selling did not vanish entirely. Records exist of sales continuing into the late 19th century and even into the early 20th. In 1913, a case was reported of a man in Leeds who sold his wife for £1. By then, the practice was rare, almost a relic of the past. But the fact that it happened at all shows how deep its roots were in English culture. It was a tradition that clung on stubbornly, even as the world around it changed. So what finally killed wife-selling? In truth, it was not just law or morality, it was shame. As Britain grew into a global empire, obsessed with projecting an image of order, morality, and superiority, the idea that Englishmen were still selling their wives in markets was an embarrassment. Reformers, politicians, and the press began to speak of it not only as a cruelty to women, but as a national disgrace. How could a nation that claimed to lead the world in civilization still allow such medieval practices? Under the weight of this growing shame, wife-selling faded into history. But though the sales ended, the scars remained. For countless women, the humiliation of being sold was not erased by the passing of time. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories often lost, but the fragments that survive tell us enough. They tell us of women who wept, women who pleaded, women who resisted, and women who endured. They tell us of children torn from their mother's arms, of laughter echoing in the marketplace as families were destroyed. They tell us of a society that allowed cruelty to pass as custom for far too long, that, and perhaps the greatest tragedy of all, is how little those women's voices were heard. In the surviving reports, they are almost always silent. Their feelings, their thoughts, their pain, are left unrecorded. We know them only through the words of the men who sold them, the men who bought them, and the reporters who mocked them. They were living, breathing human beings, reduced to footnotes in history. But looking back now, we can see their suffering as more than just a curiosity of the past. It is a warning, a reminder of what happens when law and society strip human beings of their dignity, when power is allowed to silence the vulnerable, when tradition becomes an excuse for cruelty. Wife-selling may seem unimaginable today, but it spirit the idea that one person can own another, that poverty justifies humiliation, that women's voices can be ignored still lingers in different forms around the world. And that is why this story matters. It is not just a bizarre custom from centuries ago. It is a mirror, reflecting both the darkness of the past and the dangers that remain. To tell the story of wife-selling is to give voice, at last, to the women who were silenced. It is to remember that behind every report, every market scene, every mocking headline, there was a real woman with a name, a life, and a dignity that no rope or auction could truly erase. As the Victorian age gave way to the 20th century, reforms finally gave women more rights. Divorce became easier, property rights were granted, custody laws began to change, and eventually, women won the right to vote. These victories did not erase the past, but they ensured that no woman in Britain would ever again be sold in a marketplace. The practice was buried, not just by law, but by the slow rise of justice. And so, when we look back today at the horrific reason why Victorian men sold their wives, we see more than just cruelty. We see the weight of poverty. We see the grip of patriarchy. We see the silence of the powerless, and the laughter of the powerful. But we also see change. We see the long struggle for dignity, the slow awakening of conscience, and the eventual triumph of reform. This is not just a story about the past, it is a story about humanity, about the dangers of indifference, the resilience of the oppressed, and the truth that justice, no matter how delayed, can eventually prevail. And as we close this story, one final thought remains. History is not just what we read in books. It is what we choose to remember. By remembering the women who were sold, we honor them at last. We give them the dignity denied to them in life, and we remind ourselves that the fight for justice is never truly over, because every time a woman is silenced, every time a person is treated as property, every time cruelty is excused as tradition, the echoes of Victorian wives return, and it is our responsibility, today and always, to ensure those echoes never become reality again.